In the 3rd century BC, the central Mediterranean was a mosaic of powers and ambitions, a sea crossed by merchant ships and war fleets, the scene of a dispute destined to decide the fate of the ancient world. Rome, still an expanding republic, had recently unified the Italian peninsula, imposing its supremacy on the Etruscans, Samnites, and Western Greeks. Carthage, the great Phoenician city on the coast of Africa, dominated the sea and the islands with the power of its trade and the strength of its navy. The two powers, until then separated by different interests, suddenly found themselves facing each other for the control of a land located in the center of the sea, Sicily. It was the first time that Rome looked across the strait, and that decision would change the course of its history forever. Sicily of the 3rd century BC, it was an island divided between the rich Hellenistic influence in the east and the Carthaginian presence in the west. A continuous game of alliances and rivalries boiled in its heart, between Syracuse, Agrigento, Segesta, Panormo, and the Greek or Punic colonies that competed for cities and fields. In this unstable balance, the small but fatal case of the Mamertines emerged, mercenaries from Campania who, called years earlier to help Syracuse, had taken over Messana by force, driving out its inhabitants and proclaiming themselves masters of the city. With their violent and predatory presence, they became a threat to the entire region, until the tyrant of Syracuse, Hieron II, decided to move against them to restore order. Besieged and without allies, the Mamertines sought help. First they turned to Carthage, which sent a garrison to garrison the city, but they soon feared that the help would turn into domination. It was then that, in a desperate and surprising move, they appealed to Rome. The Roman Senate hesitated. Intervening meant facing the most powerful maritime city of the time. Many still remembered the recent alliance with Carthage during the wars against Pyrrhus, and the weight of prudence urged them not to seek new wars beyond the sea. But ambition and the fear that Carthage would gain a foothold in Sicily, threatening the Straits and southern Italy, ended up prevailing. The decision was made: Rome would cross the sea. It was 264 BC. The Roman intervention began with the expedition of a small contingent commanded by the consul Appius Claudius Cottus. The troops, composed largely of legionary infantry, crossed the strait and landed near Messana, challenging the Carthaginian garrison that garrisoned the city. The Carthaginians, taken by surprise by such audacity, preferred to retreat momentarily, leaving Rome to establish a bridgehead. Hieron of Syracuse, worried by this new presence, decided to intervene, allying himself with Carthage to expel the Romans from the island. He thus found himself facing a force that, although inexperienced in overseas warfare, possessed discipline, method, and a growing confidence in its destiny. The Battle of Messana was the first direct confrontation between the Romans and Carthaginians. It was not a major pitched battle, but a series of assaults and skirmishes around the city walls. Hieron and his Punic allies attempted to lay siege to the Romans, but the army of Appius Claudius, with the typical tenacity of the legion, came out into the open field and repelled the attacks several times. The Roman legion, made up of citizen soldiers, maneuvered with geometric order, while the Carthaginian and Syracusan troops, more heterogeneous and mercenary, lacked cohesion. In the end, Hieron realized the impossibility of maintaining the siege and retreated towards Syracuse. Carthage, deprived of Syracusan support, temporarily abandoned the dispute. Rome had achieved the first moral victory of the war and a precious foothold in Sicily. The conquest of Messana marked a turning point. Rome no longer intended to limit itself to defending an ally, but to establish stable dominion over the island. The Greek and Sicilian cities, observing the Roman strength, began to change their alliances, while Carthage, surprised but not tamed, prepared its response. Hieron, sensing the new balance, decided to negotiate. He offered peace and alliance to Rome in 263 BC, guaranteeing food and supplies in exchange for the preservation of his kingdom. The agreement was accepted. Syracuse became an ally of Rome, providing a crucial logistical and diplomatic base for subsequent campaigns. The war then turned into a total conflict for the control of western Sicily. Rome, without a naval tradition, had to adapt to a war of sieges and land movements against the powerful Punic strongholds. The most important of them was Agrigento, an ancient Greek colony that became one of the main Carthaginian centers on the island. The city, located on a hill and surrounded by powerful walls, was defended by a garrison of mercenaries and a Carthaginian garrison led by Hanno. In 262 BC the two consuls, Lucius Postumius Magello and Quintus Mamilius Vitellius, marched against Agrigento with an imposing army, estimated at around 40,000 men including legions and Italian allies. The Carthaginians, understanding the threat, gathered a relief army under the command of Hanno the Great, while the city, garrisoned by the general Hanno the Younger, prepared for the siege. For the Romans, it was the first major military campaign conducted outside the peninsula, a test for the logistics, discipline, and moral stability of the troops. The siege was long and difficult. Rome did not yet possess an efficient navy and had to rely on land routes and local resources. Supplies were scarce, diseases raged among the camps, and the determination of the besieged tested the patience of the legionaries. But Roman constancy proved unshakable. The consuls set up a vast system of trenches and fortifications to isolate the city, while Hieron's Syracusan cavalry provided tactical support in raids and control of the surrounding countryside. After several months of stalemate, the Carthaginian fleet managed to land reinforcements and food for Agrigento, while Hanno's army arrived behind the Romans. A decisive battle was looming. Rome, however, held its ground. The legions, arranged in close order in front of the fields, awaited the enemy assault. Hanno attempted to surprise the enemy with a night attack and Numidian cavalry raids, but the order and discipline of the Romans neutralized any surprise. After several days of fighting, the Carthaginian army, worn out and unable to break the siege, was forced to retreat. Agrigento, now exhausted by hunger, fell into the hands of the Romans. The capture of Agrigento was the Republic's first great success in the war. The city was sacked, the population enslaved, and the loot brought back to Rome as a trophy of legionary valor. But the victory had a price. Carthage, despite losing the city, was not defeated. He understood that the war could no longer be limited to defending his Sicilian strongholds. It had to move to the sea, where Punic power was still unchallenged. Rome, on the other hand, had understood the need for a fleet, an indispensable tool for supporting the war on an island and countering the maritime superiority of the enemy. The first phase of the conflict therefore ended with an ambiguous situation. Rome had conquered solid positions in Sicily and a growing prestige, but it found itself faced with a new war, different from those fought until then. The legions had proven their worth in the field, but now the might of the sea had to be faced. Ancient historians saw in these years the dawn of a new destiny, the moment in which Rome, from a land power, began to look towards the Mediterranean horizon. The bloodshed at Messana and Agrigento was but the prelude to a long and merciless war, a struggle of will and ingenuity between two civilizations that could not coexist in the same sea. After the conquest of Agrigento, the war in Sicily did not end, but changed its shape and horizon. Carthage, wounded but not defeated, understood that the terrain of the dispute could not remain that of the earth, where the Roman legions had shown superior discipline and capacity for resistance. His true domain was the sea, and he decided to build his response on that domain. Rome, for its part, was under no illusions. The fall of Agrigento was not enough to collapse a maritime empire. The Carthaginian fortresses of Panormo, Drepanum, Lilybaeum, and Motia remained intact, well defended by garrisons and fleets that sailed the western Mediterranean without rivals. The Romans, a people of farmers and land warriors, found themselves faced with an obstacle they had never faced. Yet, as in every turning point in their history, they were able to transform necessity into virtue. It was in these years that Rome decided to become a naval power, not by vocation but by strategy and survival. It is said that the Romans, having no experience in building large warships, took possession of a Carthaginian quinquereme shipwrecked on the coast of southern Italy and made it the model for their fleet. In a few months, thanks to the discipline of the legionaries and the organization of the Senate, more than 100 ships were born, built with a speed that amazed even the ancient chroniclers. The legions transformed into sailors, and the sea, until then considered a frontier, became the new battlefield. But the Romans, inexperienced in naval maneuver and tactics, knew they could not win on the basis of seamanship. The Carthaginians had dominated the waves for centuries, heirs of the Phoenician tradition, skilled oarsmen and experts on the winds and currents. Rome responded with ingenuity. It invented the Corvus, a mobile walkway equipped with hooks which, lowered onto the enemy bridge, transformed every naval clash into an infantry battle. It was the war brought back to its own terrain, the strategy of those who knew how to win not with agility, but with discipline. The test of fire came in 260 BC near Mylae, on the northern coast of Sicily. The consul Gaius Duilius commanded the new Roman fleet, made up of around 120 warships. In front of him was Hannibal Giscon's Carthaginian fleet, experienced and numerous. The Romans were intimidated by the open sea, but Duilius, aware that the future of the war was being decided at that moment, ordered an attack. As the enemy ships approached in formation, the Romans lowered their ravens. The wooden bridges crashed into the Carthaginian bridges, and the legions leapt into hand-to-hand combat. The sea transformed into an expanse of weapons and screams, a floating battlefield. The effect was devastating. The Carthaginians, without space to maneuver, were overwhelmed by the Roman shock force. Duilius destroyed or captured over 50 enemy ships, and Mylae's victory marked the birth of Roman maritime power. For the first time Rome obtained a triumph for a battle fought on the sea, and Duilius had a rostral column erected in the Forum, decorated with the beaks of enemy ships, symbol of a conquest that was not only military, but spiritual. Rome had learned to dominate the element that had instilled fear in it until a few years earlier. After Mylae, the war spread throughout Sicily and along the coasts of Sardinia and Corsica. Carthage, although stricken, still retained naval dominance and responded with rapid and devastating incursions. In 258 BC, near Sulci, the Romans achieved a new victory, consolidating their presence in the western Mediterranean. But the sea was not an easy ally. Storms destroyed many a fleet, and Roman commanders learned that the marine element demanded respect as much as courage. Meanwhile, in Sicily, the land war continued slowly. Rome, supported by its Syracusan ally, consolidated its positions, building fortifications and garrisoning the passes that separated the eastern part of the island, now loyal, from the western part, still firmly Carthaginian. The battles of those years were often sieges and local clashes, lacking the epic grandeur of future campaigns, but fundamental for wearing down the enemy and securing bases and supplies. Carthage, faithful to its tradition of using mercenaries, continued to recruit troops from all over Africa, from Spain and the Balearic Islands, mixing different peoples and languages under the command of its generals. The Romans, on the other hand, fought with citizen soldiers, bound by the discipline of the Republic and by the certainty that every victory would be a collective conquest. The fleet, now tested, became an instrument of attack. Rome was not content with dominating the seas around Sicily, but decided to bring the war directly to the African coasts. The idea was audacious, perhaps reckless, to strike Carthage in its own territory, breaking its capacity for economic and moral resistance. It was 256 BC when the consuls Marcus Atilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Vulsone set sail with one of the most impressive fleets ever seen in the Mediterranean, 330 Roman and 120 allied quinquiremes, loaded with legionaries, horses, siege engines and food. The Carthaginians, led by Hamilcar, gathered around 350 ships to block their way near Cape Ecnomo, on the southern coast of Sicily. The ensuing battle was one of the largest in ancient history. The fleets faced each other in complex order. The Romans arranged their ships in a wedge formation, with the consuls' flagships in the lead, followed by the wings extending to the sides, ready to close in on the enemy. The Carthaginians tried to go around the Roman point and envelop the flanks, but once again the Corvus and the discipline of the legions on board decided the outcome. The Punic ships, trapped in the melee, were overwhelmed. The Roman victory was total. Over 100 Carthaginian ships were sunk or captured. After Cape Ecnomus, the sea opened up in front of Rome. The legions landed in Africa, near Clupea, and for the first time Carthaginian soil was trampled by Roman soldiers. The invasion was initially successful. The coastal cities surrendered, the Numidian allies rebelled against Punic rule, and Regulus advanced inland, winning at Audes and forcing Carthage to sue for peace. But the African Republic was not yet tamed. The Carthaginians, using their inexhaustible ability to adapt, enlisted a new army of mercenaries under the command of a Spartan leader, Xanthippus, expert in pitched warfare. When Regulus, confident in his fortune, marched towards Tunis, he found in front of him an enemy who knew the art of Greek maneuver and discipline. Xanthippus exploited the favorable terrain, lured the Romans into a closed field between hills and swamps and overwhelmed them with a combined charge of cavalry and heavy infantry. The defeat was complete. Regulus was taken prisoner and his army annihilated. Africa, which seemed one step away from submission, closed like a fist on the Roman dream. Carthage, however, could not fully enjoy success. A violent storm destroyed part of the victorious fleet, and the Romans, despite being tried, managed to evacuate the survivors and save most of their men. The war, once again, returned to the point of equilibrium. Rome had experienced the sea, glory and defeat, but had not lost the will to resist. The experience of the African campaign revealed the enormous complexity of the conflict, the need for a solid economy, continuous supplies and coordinated strategies between land and sea. In those 6 years the Republic had changed profoundly. He had built a fleet from scratch, he had won and lost at sea, he had seen his soldiers fight in Africa, far from their homeland. Every battle, every storm, every wreck of a ship increased his knowledge and his steadfastness. Rome was no longer just a power on the earth. It had become a war civilization capable of adapting to every element. Carthage, while maintaining its strength, began to sense that its opponent would not give in. The Mediterranean, once the domain of Phoenician merchants, was now crossed by sails bearing the eagle and the name of Rome. The sea that separated the two powers was now a continuous battlefield, a horizon of wood, iron and blood, where the destiny of a future empire was taking shape. After the overwhelming victory at Cape Ecnomus, Rome found itself one step away from an undertaking that no Italic people had ever attempted, bringing the war to African soil. It was the culmination of a parable of audacity that in just a few years had transformed a land republic into a power capable of dominating the waves. The consuls Marcus Attilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Vulsone received orders from the Senate to continue beyond Sicily, cross the sea, and strike Carthage in the heart of its dominion. It was no longer a simple war for Sicily, but a confrontation for the political and economic survival of the two civilizations. The African power, accustomed to fighting far from its ports, did not imagine that a foreign enemy could land within a few miles of its walls. Rome, on the other hand, felt the exhilaration of a destiny that now seemed invincible. The Roman fleet, made up of more than 300 ships, sailed the waters of the Sicilian Channel with a majesty that ancient historians described as a procession of power rather than a simple army on the move. The red banners of the consuls waved on the quinquiremes, and the rhythm of the drum resounded among the ranks of the rowers, marking the synchrony of the movements. When the African coast appeared on the horizon, the soldiers looked at the beaches with a sort of reverent amazement. It was the land from which the riches of the Punic world came, the center from which a 1,000-year-old commercial empire radiated. The landing took place near Clupea, a fortified city on the eastern coast of present-day Tunisia. The operation was quick and orderly. The Carthaginians, taken by surprise, were unable to prevent the troops from descending, and Regulus immediately fortified the position, ensuring a safe port and a supply base. Within weeks, nearby coastal cities, fearful of Roman power, surrendered. The African soldiers enlisted to defend those strongholds dispersed or went over to the enemy. For the first time Carthage felt the fear that an enemy might besiege its own walls. Regulus advanced inland with about 15,000 men and 500 knights, leaving part of the troops to garrison the fleet. Carthage quickly gathered a mixed army, made up of Libyans, Iberians, Celts and Greek mercenaries, supported by war elephants, a symbol of African power. The clash was not long in coming. Near Audes, the Romans faced and defeated the bulk of the Carthaginian army, which failed to exploit its numerical advantage and gave in to the compactness of the legions. Punic losses were heavy, and many inland cities rebelled against Carthage, hoping to obtain clemency from the victors. After the Battle of Audes, Carthage found itself exhausted. The Punic Senate sent ambassadors to negotiate peace, but Regulus, blinded by pride and convinced that the war was now won, imposed intolerable conditions: destruction of the enemy fleet, cession of a large part of the African territory, annual tributes and the prohibition for Carthage to wage war without the authorization of Rome. The Punic dignitaries retreated in indignation, vowing that they would fight to the end. It was then that a man destined to change the outcome of the campaign entered the scene: Xanthippus, a Spartan mercenary in the service of Carthage. trained in laconic discipline, an expert in tactics and an expert in maneuver warfare, he took command of the Punic forces and imposed a complete reorganization of the army. He reduced the number of unreliable mercenaries, trained the African troops according to the Greek model, and prepared the field for a counterattack. His first move was to lure Regulus into a trap. The Roman consul, convinced that the enemy was in disarray, advanced towards Tunis, pushing into territory he did not know, rich in gorges and hills. Xanthippus chose the site of the battle with care. He waited for the legions, exhausted by the heat and the lack of supplies, to position themselves in an open field and then launched the assault. The Punic elephants, placed in the front line, broke into the Roman ranks, sowing panic and disorder. Behind them, African infantry and Numidian cavalry surrounded the isolated maniples. The Battle of Tunis was a massacre. The legion, trapped and unable to maintain formation, gave way. Few managed to fall back towards Clupea. Regulus was captured along with thousands of soldiers. The defeat marked the end of the African dream. Carthage, which a few weeks earlier was on the verge of collapse, began to breathe again. The victory of Xanthippus was celebrated as a military miracle, and the city thanked the gods with sacrifices and solemn celebrations. But the war was not over. The Roman fleet, which had maintained control of the coasts, managed to save part of the surviving army, evacuating the veterans and bringing them back to Sicily. However, the return was disastrous. A storm, perhaps the most violent of those years, hit the fleet off the Strait of Sicily and destroyed over 200 ships. Thousands of men drowned, and for the first time Rome understood the weight of the sea as an adversary as much as Carthage. Despite the catastrophe, the Republic did not give up the conflict. In 255 BC, the Senate sent new troops and ordered the construction of a new fleet, almost as if the defeat were nothing but a parenthesis in the path of its destiny. Ancient historians underlined this trait of implacable will. Where others would have given in, Rome began again from scratch, rebuilding what had been lost with a speed that revealed not only material power, but faith in its mission. Regulus, meanwhile, remained a prisoner in Carthage. Roman sources, enriched with legendary tones, narrated that the Carthaginians sent him to Rome as an ambassador to negotiate an exchange of prisoners, imposing on him an oath to return if the Senate refused. Regulus, having arrived in his homeland, advised his fellow citizens not to accept enemy conditions, maintaining that the war should continue until complete victory. Then, true to his word, he would voluntarily return to Carthage, where he suffered torture and death. Beyond the legend, the episode, whether true or symbolic, became the emblem of Roman austerity and the belief that the honor of the state was worth more than life itself. The African defeat taught Rome a lot. It demonstrated that the tactical superiority of the legions was not enough when logistics failed, and that an army far from the homeland was as vulnerable as an army without supplies. Naval and land warfare had to be coordinated, and the Republic understood that final victory depended not only on strength of arms, but on the ability to sustain a sustained effort. Carthage, in turn, understood that its dominance was no longer guaranteed. Rome had dared to land on its soil, and this was enough to shake the 1,000-year-old security of the Punics. At the end of that year of blood and storms, both powers found themselves exhausted but still standing. Sicily once again became the main battlefield, while Africa, although safe, remained restless. The Mediterranean, which for centuries had known the balance of Phoenician trade and the neutrality of the routes, was now transformed into a field of war. The ships, ports and coasts had become instruments of a dispute that did not stop even in the face of the most terrible losses. The African expedition, although it ended in defeat, represented a historical turning point. Rome had demonstrated that it could carry war beyond the confines of its geographical sphere, and this paved the way for an imperial destiny. Carthage had saved its homeland thanks to the genius of a foreign commander, but at the price of revealing its dependence on mercenaries and treacherous allies. Every Punic victory in those years hid a political fragility. Every Roman defeat, however, became a lesson. When the last surviving ships of the Roman fleet returned to the ports of Sicily, with their hulls broken and their men marked by salt and pain, the Senate spoke not of dishonor, but of perseverance. The losses were immense, but the Republic did not know surrender. The storm that had engulfed the ships had not extinguished the fire of determination. Indeed, From those murky waters a new awareness was born. The dominion of the sea cannot be achieved in a year or with a single victory, but with the constancy of a civilization that does not fear destruction in order to assert itself. The African campaign closed the first major offensive cycle of the war. Rome, although beaten, had discovered the limits of its power, and at the same time the extent of its resilience. Carthage had avoided collapse, but had seen its cities burn and its fleets bleed. They both knew the fight wasn't over. In the silence that followed the storm, while the sea became calm again and the Sicilian coasts prepared for new battles, the fate of the Mediterranean remained suspended between two peoples who could no longer coexist. The war was only halfway through its journey, but the ancient world was already trembling at the thought of what price final victory would demand. After the disastrous African campaign and the loss of the fleet, Rome found itself at a critical point in its history. The sea, which a few years earlier had opened the way to glory for her, had also revealed itself to be her harshest judge. The human and material losses were immense, but the Republic did not know the word defeat. The Senate, faithful to the logic of resistance that had forged Roman power, decided to rebuild the fleet once again. The legions were no longer enough. To win against Carthage, mistress of the waves and the western strongholds of Sicily, it was necessary to return to dominating the sea. Thus it was that, with the help of citizens and rich knights, private funds were raised to build new quinquiremes. In an extraordinarily short time, Rome once again had a sufficient naval force to resume operations. It was no longer the improvised ardor of the early years, but the clear determination of a power that had understood the need for continuity. Carthage, meanwhile, was trying to exploit its advantage. The western coasts of Sicily, from Lilybaeum to Drepanum, were still firmly in his hands. These cities, carefully fortified and constantly supplied by sea, represented the bulwark of the Punic presence on the island. Carthaginian commanders, including Hamilcar and Hanno, alternated raids and sieges, trying to wear down the Roman forces and isolate their garrisons. Rome, for its part, knew that the key to victory was the total conquest of Sicily. Every stone, every hill and every disputed port took on the symbolic value of a chapter in the struggle between two worlds. In 254 BC, the war revived with the Roman attack against Panormo, modern Palermo, one of the strongest Carthaginian outposts on the northern coast. The consuls Aulus Atilius Collatinus and Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio led the legions across Sicily, while the revived Roman fleet blocked supplies by sea. The siege was long, but the city, struck by hunger and fear, fell after hard fighting. Panormo became the main Roman stronghold in the north of the island, and its conquest marked a strategic turning point. For the first time, Punic forces were driven from one of their large strongholds. The victory, however, was not enough to subdue Carthage. The Punics, aware of their land inferiority, concentrated every effort on naval defense and on maintaining their last positions. Drepanum and Lilybaeum, located on the western tip of Sicily, became the heart of the Carthaginian resistance. Their walls, thick and well-manned, were surrounded by natural ports that allowed the continuous arrival of supplies. Every Roman attempt to besiege them clashed with the mobility of the enemy fleets, which appeared and disappeared rapidly, escaping the blockades and cutting the Roman lines of communication. In 250 BC, Rome decided to launch the decisive attack against Drepanum. The command was entrusted to the consul Publius Claudio Pulchro, a man of great audacity but known for imprudence. The Roman fleet, made up of over 200 ships, moved during the night to take the enemy by surprise. However, an ominous sign appeared on the eve of the battle. When the consul consulted the wishes and released the sacred chickens to observe the omens, the animals refused to eat. Pulcher, irritated, threw them into the sea, pronouncing the phrase that history would pass down as an emblem of pride: "If they don't want to eat, let them drink." That act, which the ancients saw as impiety, preceded one of the most serious defeats of the Roman navy. The Battle of Drepanum was fought in the waters of Trapani. The Carthaginian commander Adherbal, experienced and prudent, used his knowledge of the port and the winds to lure the Romans into a narrow space. The Roman ships, disorganized and poorly placed, collided with each other, losing cohesion. The Carthaginians, more agile and master of maneuvers, surrounded them and destroyed them. Over 80 Roman ships were captured, many more sunk. Pulcher managed to escape, but his naval army was lost. It was a terrible blow. Rome, which had taken years to rebuild its fleet, now saw it annihilated in a few hours. As news of the defeat spread, Carthage caught its breath. For a brief moment, the island became contested again. Punic maritime superiority seemed to be re-established. However, the war did not stop. The consul Lucius Junius Pullus attempted to restore supply lines and send new troops to Sicily, but his fleet was also overwhelmed by a storm near Cape Passaro. The Romans once again lost hundreds of ships. Those consecutive catastrophes would have destroyed the will of any other nation, but not that of Rome. The Senate did not give in to panic and continued to send troops, maintaining pressure on the Punic fortresses. In this period, the protagonist of the Carthaginian resistance in Sicily was Hamilcar Barca, father of Hannibal. A skilled commander, Hamilcar refused to compete in pitched battles, preferring a war of movement and raids. He suddenly attacked the Roman garrisons, hit the convoys and retreated to the heights. His strategy was to wear down the enemy, making every Roman victory costly and every march a chore. This method, which would later inspire future Punic wars, transformed Sicily into a field of prolonged guerrilla warfare. Rome responded by strengthening the conquered positions and entrusting the control of the main centers to the legions. The years between 254 and 250 BC were marked by a continuous alternation of sieges and skirmishes. At Lilybaeum, the Romans attempted several times to storm the walls with siege towers and catapults, but the defenders, supported by the sea, always managed to repel the attacks. The Carthaginians used small fast ships to bring reinforcements and supplies into the city, mocking Roman vigilance. The two powers fought not only for possession of territory, but to demonstrate their ability to resist. Every day of war was a message of will sent to the enemy. Despite the losses, Rome maintained control of most of the island. Syracuse, a faithful ally, guaranteed the supply bases and grain supplies. The alliance with Hiero proved decisive, as it allowed the Romans to resist during the hardest years. The war had now taken on a character of total attrition, where force was no longer enough. Patience, perseverance and resources were needed. The Carthaginians, increasingly dependent on mercenaries, had to pay dearly for each army, while Rome, supported by its citizens and the Italic legions, could count on an almost inexhaustible human pool. By 250 BC, the situation had become clear. Carthage retained only its western strongholds, while Rome dominated most of the island. But the war was far from over. The island, devastated by years of fighting, was covered in burnt fields and half-destroyed cities. Ancient historians describe those years as a period of incessant effort, in which the courage of individuals was confused with the collective resistance of entire populations. The Sicilian peasants, the African mercenaries, the Italian legionaries and the sailors of both fleets became part of a tragedy that exceeded the sum of the battles. In the midst of that war of sand and blood, Rome consolidated its imperial character. Every defeat, every storm, every loss of ship or man became an act of learning. The legions learned to fight against incursions, to defend themselves from Numidian horses, to move in unknown terrain. The Roman commanders, although sometimes mediocre, gained experience. The Republic, in its bureaucratic slowness, showed a tenacity that no Mediterranean people had ever equaled. Carthage, on the other hand, was beginning to feel the cracks in its system. Military spending was growing, trade routes were threatened, and dependence on mercenaries generated internal tensions. The Punic people, closed in their splendid metropolis, began to look with fear at the possibility of a definitive defeat. The years of war also eroded trust in the city's ancient deities and aristocratic institutions. The echoes of Roman victories reached the walls of Carthage, and the sea, once its natural defense, now seemed like a fragile border. At the end of this phase, neither of the two powers could claim to be victorious, but the balance tipped increasingly towards Rome. Sicily, although devastated, was now almost entirely under his influence, and the Carthaginians, closed in their ports, fought more for survival than for conquest. The war, which began as a regional dispute, had become a duel of will and civilization. In those years of minor battles and endless sieges, history was preparing for its climax. The blood shed on the beaches of Drepanum and on the walls of Lilybaeum announced that the end of the First Punic War would be decided not in the arid land of Sicily, but once again on the sea, where it all began. The long war in Sicily had reached the point where fatigue threatened to extinguish the forces of both contenders. After years of sieges, storms and defeats, Rome and Carthage still faced each other, like two giants exhausted but incapable of giving in. The Republic, despite having lost its fleet and commanders, never abandoned itself to defeatism. Every defeat was followed by a rebirth, every loss by a new levy of men. In the Senate, the belief that victory was still possible was accompanied by the awareness that only the sea, the same element that had punished Rome so many times, could now decide the fate of the war. Carthage, although tested, retained a decisive advantage in the waters and still possessed two inviolate bastions in Sicily, Lilybaeum and Drepanum. Those ports, stubbornly defended, were like two anchors cast into the island, and as long as they remained in Punic hands, the Roman victory could not be considered accomplished. After the naval defeat of Drepanum, the Roman command was entrusted to Quintus Valerius Faultus and Lucius Junius Pullus. Their first mission was to rebuild the logistical capacity necessary to maintain the Sicilian garrisons, continually threatened by Carthaginian attacks and starvation. The Punics, masters of the sea, intercepted the convoys, cutting off supplies. Rome, accustomed to land wars, discovered that naval logistics was an art as complex as military strategy. It was then that the Senate understood the need for a stable and professional fleet, no longer improvised, no longer built for a single campaign. In 249 BC, a final misguided attempt to bring the conflict back to the sea ended in disaster. The consul Publius Claudio Pulsar, already responsible for the defeat of Drepanum, attempted to surprise the enemy fleet at Lilybaeum but found himself hindered by contrary winds and currents. The enterprise failed, and Rome understood that dominion over the waters could not be achieved through audacity alone. A coherent strategy was needed, supported by long-term economic and technical strength. However, the Republic, although bent, was not broken. The Senate suspended naval operations for a few years and concentrated its forces on the land war. In Sicily, meanwhile, the situation remained tense. Hamilcar Barca, appointed commander of the Punic forces, adopted constant guerrilla tactics. He avoided head-on clashes and struck where the Romans were most vulnerable. His troops moved lightly, supported by the Numidian cavalry and by the local populations still loyal to Carthage. Hamilcar controlled the Eryx Mountains and the inaccessible areas around Panormo, exploiting his knowledge of the territory. Every time a Roman contingent advanced, it was attacked, worn down and forced to retreat. The war turned into a slow bleeding. Rome responded by appointing prudent and persevering commanders, including Gaius Lutatius Catulus, who would embody the silent tenacity of the Republic. The legions, although exhausted, held their positions. No part of Sicily was abandoned, even though the war was not progressing. The years passed, and the conflict dragged on in an unstable equilibrium. Carthage, although still master of the sea, saw its ability to finance the war diminish. The costs of mercenaries and fleets had become unsustainable. The Iberian silver mines were no longer enough, and the Mediterranean trade, from which the city drew its lifeblood, was paralyzed. Every merchant ship risked being captured, every convoy needed an armed escort. In 247 BC, Hamilcar Barca conducted a series of daring operations that earned him the reputation of a brilliant commander. With small contingents, he suddenly landed on the eastern coasts of Sicily, devastated the territories controlled by Rome and then retreated towards his bases, mocking his adversaries. On several occasions he put entire legions to flight with night attacks. However, no matter how clever his maneuvers, they could not change the substance of the war. The Romans continued to control most of the island and had virtually unlimited human resources. The Punic tactical genius was no longer enough against the organized Roman power. It was in this context of stalemate that Rome made a decision destined to change the fate of the conflict. Some wealthy citizens, including members of the great families of Valerii, Cornelii and Claudii, offered to finance a new fleet at their own expense. It was not an act of vainglory, but a collective demonstration of trust in the Roman mission. In a few months, 200 new quinquiremes were built, lighter and more maneuverable than the previous ones, and the oarsmen were trained methodically. The command of the fleet was entrusted to Gaius Lutatius Catulus, a prudent, methodical and highly disciplined man. In 242 BC, Catullus set sail for Sicily. The objective was clear: to close the sea to Carthage, interrupt all connections with the garrisons of Lilybaeum and Drepanum, and force the Punics to surrender through starvation. The operation was prepared with a care never seen before. Each ship was equipped with reserves of water, food, and repair materials. The sails were strengthened, the command chains simplified. There was no more room for improvisation. Carthage, taken by surprise, hastened to send a new relief fleet, loaded with supplies and soldiers, to break the blockade. Hanno, a veteran of the war, was placed in command, but time and tiredness had weakened his spirit and the discipline of his men. In the spring of 241 BC, the two fleets met near the Aegadi Islands, off the western coast of Sicily. It was the day that would decide the fate of the longest war the Mediterranean had ever known. The Carthaginian ships, heavy and loaded with supplies, had difficulty maneuvering. The Romans, who knew the battlefield, chose the wind in their favor. Catullus had his ships lightened, ordering to unload everything that was not essential for combat, to obtain greater speed and stability. When the wind changed, he gave the signal to attack. The Battle of the Aegadi was a colossal clash of wood and iron. The Roman quinquiremes launched themselves against the enemy line with almost geometric precision. The beaks sank into the opposing hulls, while the crews faced each other hand to hand on the covers of the ships. The Romans, trained and sober, fought methodically, striking and retreating, avoiding being surrounded. The Carthaginians, more numerous but less organized, soon found themselves in difficulty. The front ranks gave way, and chaos spread to the rear. Hanno attempted to save part of the fleet, but it was too late. Over 50 Punic ships were sunk, 70 captured, and the remainder fled to the African coast. When the sea calmed down and the waves brought the remains of the boats ashore, the war was over. Carthage no longer had ships, nor the means to support their construction. His garrisons in Sicily were isolated, the ports blocked, the treasury exhausted. Hanno sent ambassadors to Rome to ask for peace. The conditions imposed by Catullus were harsh but not destructive. Carthage would have to evacuate Sicily, return all prisoners without ransom, pay a large monetary indemnity, and forever renounce waging war in Italy or in the surrounding waters. It was the end of an era. When the news reached Rome, the people rejoiced like never before. The war had lasted 23 years, longer than any other in the citizens' memory. Entire generations had been born and died under its weight. The victory was not only military, but moral. The Republic had demonstrated that perseverance could overcome even the oldest empire in the Mediterranean. In the Senate, the speakers spoke not of glory, but of duty accomplished. No personal triumph, no exaltation of a single commander. The victory belonged to the state and its discipline. Carthage, although defeated, was not annihilated. Its ports remained intact, its walls stood, but its spirit was wounded. The loss of Sicily meant the loss of its largest outpost and main source of grain. The mercenaries, who returned from the island, rebelled shortly after due to non-payment, giving rise to the terrible War of the Mercenaries, which almost destroyed the city. Rome, however, emerged from the conflict transformed. It had learned to dominate the sea, had built a navy worthy of the great powers, and had appeared on the international scene as the new force destined to govern the Mediterranean. The echo of the Aegadi victory resonated for a long time. The elders remembered the days when the city didn't even own a ship and had relied on copying enemy vessels to build its first fleet. Now Rome could look to the horizon as master of the routes, with its ports bustling with activity and its magistrates already planning new ventures. Sicily, now a Roman province, became the symbol of republican tenacity. Every plowed field and every rebuilt port on that island bore the imprint of the sacrifice of thousands of men who had fought for an ideal of power and order. The First Punic War ended like this, in the roar of the waves and in the silence of the vanquished. Rome had not only won, but had learned the language of the sea, the grammar of logistics, the value of collective perseverance. Carthage, although surviving, knew that its enemy would not stop. The ancient lady of commerce saw the rise, on her own routes, of a new, colder, more methodical, more implacable power. And the Mediterranean, which for centuries had experienced the balance of Phoenician trade and Hellenic colonies, now became the mare nostrum of the Romans. The peace signed in 241 BC formally closed the longest conflict that the Mediterranean world had ever known until then. But as often happens after a war of such intensity, the quiet brought not relief, but a new kind of anxiety. Rome and Carthage, the two powers that had disputed the dominion of an island and a sea for 23 years, emerged from the confrontation irreversibly changed. Neither was the same one who had waged the war. The first had learned the language of the empire, the second had tasted the bitterness of defeat and the awareness of her own decline. Rome, after the victory, did not experience the peace of the victors, but a fervor of organization and consolidation. Sicily, now under his control, became the first Roman province in history. It was not incorporated as an Italic territory, but as an administered and taxed dominion. The magistrates sent from Rome, the praetors and quaestors, introduced a system of regular collection, guaranteeing the Republic a constant flow of grain and tribute. The island, devastated by years of wars, was repopulated with settlers and veterans. Greek cities, such as Syracuse and Agrigento, maintained relative autonomy, while the former Punic strongholds were subjected to rigid military control. Thus, from the scorched soil of Sicily, Rome learned to govern different peoples, to transform conquest into administration, victory into a lasting structure. Carthage, however, returned home defeated and exhausted. Its surviving ships moored in the ports like ghosts of a glorious past, and the survivors told of the terrible losses of the Aegidi. The city, although safe from physical destruction, was morally on its knees. The coffers were empty, the trade routes compromised, and the African, Iberian and Ligurian mercenaries, who had fought for years in Sicily, demanded the promised payment. But the Carthaginian Senate, impoverished and paralyzed by internal factions, hesitated. That hesitation would have become a catastrophe. As soon as they returned to the African continent, the mercenaries camped near Sicca Veneria, not far from Carthage, waiting to receive their compensation. At first they remained calm, but soon hunger and frustration ignited the revolt. When the government attempted to defer payments, discontent exploded. The rebellion spread like wildfire. The mercenary army, led by Spendius and Mathos, two unscrupulous adventurers, became a devastating horde. Thousands of African slaves and farmers joined the revolt, attracted by the promise of revenge against their Punic masters. Thus began the so-called War of the Mercenaries, or War without a name, which ancient historians described as the most atrocious ever fought. Carthage, deprived of its army and its generals, was forced to fight for its survival. The rebel troops conquered Tunis, massacred entire garrisons and reached the walls of the metropolis. The ancient chroniclers tell of prisoners crucified along the streets, of cities burned and fields devastated. Africa itself, the heart of the Punic Empire, seemed to rebel against its lady. Only desperation gave Carthage the strength to react. Among the moral ruins of the defeat, a man emerged, Hamilcar Barca, the same commander who had stood up to the Romans in Sicily. With a small force of veterans, he took command and re-established discipline. His war was not only military, but spiritual. It rebuilt the trust of the citizens, reorganized the defenses and brought the city back to the dignity of the struggle. Hamilcar applied to the rebellion the same techniques he had learned in Sicily: rapid movement, sudden attacks, exploitation of the terrain. He cut off the rebels' supply routes, forcing them to starve, and finally destroyed them in fierce battles along the Bagradas River. Spendius and Mathos were captured and executed, and their troops annihilated. The mercenary war, which lasted from 241 to 237 BC, left a desert of ruins and corpses. But from its ashes a different Carthage was reborn, harder, more closed, more determined to never suffer the humiliation of the enemy again. During those same years, Rome carefully observed African events. The Republic, although satisfied with its victory, could not ignore the danger that a Punic revival would represent. When Sardinia and Corsica, two islands that Carthage had kept partly under control, rebelled and asked Rome for protection, the Senate seized the opportunity. Exploiting the weakness of the African city, Rome imposed the cession of those territories and demanded further monetary compensation. Carthage, still on its knees after the mercenary war, was forced to accept. It was a very hard blow. Not only did he lose the last positions in the Tyrrhenian Sea, but he suffered a new humiliation without having been able to fight. From that moment, the Roman Republic became the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. The sea that for centuries had resounded with the Phoenician ships was now crossed by the red banners of the Roman quinquiremes. The routes between Ostia, Messina and Carthage were dominated by the power of Rome, and the new provinces of Sicily, Sardinia and Corsica guaranteed the Republic's strategic control over the grain and trade routes. The victory had not only expanded the borders, but had transformed the Roman political soul. The Senate began to think in terms of imperium, no longer just defense. The legions were no longer occasional instruments of war, but permanent instruments of republican power. While Rome consolidated its new position, Carthage closed in on itself, but with a different spirit. Hamilcar Barca, having returned triumphant from the mercenary war, had become the most powerful man in the city. He knew that the peace imposed by Rome would not last. He could not forget the lost Sicily, the humiliations suffered, the economic impositions. However, he understood that a new conflict could not arise immediately. Carthage needed resources, a faithful army, new territories from which to extract gold and silver to pay tribute and prepare for revenge. His gaze then turned towards the west, towards the Iberian Peninsula. Spain, with its mines and its warlike tribes, appeared as a promised land for the Punic revival. Hamilcar landed there with his army in 237 BC, founding a base in Gades, today's Cadiz, and from there began a slow and methodical conquest of the hinterland. The Iberian cities, attracted by the riches and military art of the Carthaginians, allied themselves with him or were subjugated. The silver mines of Baetica began to supply precious metals which allowed Carthage to recover economically. Hamilcar created a personal army, made up of Iberians and Africans, linked no longer to the city but to his name and his family. In that private legion the seed of future revenge was forged. While Rome absent-mindedly observed the Carthaginian expansion in Spain, convinced that the enemy was now distant and tamed, Hamilcar passed on his dream of revenge to his young son Hannibal. According to tradition, the boy, still a child, swore before the altar of Baal to hate Rome forever. That oath, whether real or symbolic, embodied the spirit of an entire generation of Carthaginians who had not forgotten the shame of defeat. From that promise was born the future storm that would upset the ancient world. The legacy of the First Punic War was not only territorial, but moral and psychological. Rome had learned that no enemy could resist it if the collective will remained firm. It had built naval infrastructure, developed supply systems, and refined its military bureaucracy. But that same confidence also generated pride. The Romans began to consider themselves invincible, forgetting that the fortune of the sea can change with the wind. Carthage, however, learned the opposite, that defeat can be a more effective teacher than victory. From his pain was born a new concept of war, based on strategy, speed, cunning rather than brute force. When Hamilcar died in battle in Spain, command passed to his son-in-law Hasdrubal, who founded the city of Cartagena, the new capital of the Iberian dominions. Under him and then under Hannibal, Carthage transformed into a territorial power, more military than mercantile, ready one day to compete with Rome again. The sea, which had once been the main arena of their clash, became only the border of a future conflict that would take place on land, across the mountains and plains of Italy. Thus ended the epic of the First Punic War, with a victorious Rome but unaware of the challenge that history would soon present to it, and with a wounded but untamed Carthage, intent on being reborn in the silence of the Iberian mines and in the oath of a child. The waves that had seen the dawn of their first confrontation now retreated calmly, but beneath their surface the memory of blood and iron still boiled. The shadow of Punic revenge was already stretching across the horizon of the Mediterranean, and the distant echo of a new war was beginning to vibrate like an omen on the routes that linked Rome to the coasts of Spain.